Now it came to pass upon a day that Jonathan the son of Saul said unto the young men that bare his armor, Come and let us go over to the Philistine garrison that is on the other side. But he told not his father. You may be seated. While Saul is camping in Gibeah underneath a pomegranate tree, his son Jonathan is going out to battle against the greatest enemies that Israel has at this time, the Philistines. The Philistines have been a thorn in the people of Israel's side for a long, long time. And I got terrible news, they're not going anywhere anytime soon either. So, all of these things considered, originally we know that God established Saul as the king of Israel. God chose this man from the little tribe of Benjamin. In my Kings of Israel class today, we began to look at Ahab and Jezebel, and looking at the beginning of the ministry of Elijah, the prophet, Elijah the Tishbite. And you know, it's such a cool name, but there is nothing special about being a Tishbite. Tishba, the town where Elijah was from, where he got his legal name from. Tishba was to Israel what Jacksonport is to the United States of America. If I go to Washington, D.C., and I ask the president, have you ever heard of Jacksonport, Arkansas? He's going to probably look at me and go, what's a Arkansas? You know what I mean? So,
not even what's a Jacksonport,
yeah.
What's an Arkansas.
So, God chooses the lowest of the low and the least qualified to prove how he can do great and mighty things with little to nothing. And he always does that. And Saul really is that kind of a story. A man who, when we first meet him, is looking for his father's donkeys. He's not a warrior, he's not a politician, and he's from the tribe of Benjamin. And if you've ever looked at the ending of Judges, you know that the tribe of Benjamin has a history that has put shame on that entire tribe at this point. So, it's a small tribe at that, but it doesn't matter. The backstory, the history of Saul's home, it just doesn't matter. God once again chooses someone who at first, in some aspects, just is not qualified. When God first chooses Saul, we know that there are instant skeptics, people criticizing Saul, saying, who is this man? Thinking that this man is going to lead us from the Philistines. And God said that those skeptics were children of the devil, don't listen to them. So, all of this considered, God had chosen Saul to be the king of Israel, and God had originally willed it for Saul's family and his descendants to remain on the throne of Israel, as Samuel revealed to us in the previous chapter last week, how God had willed, or at least permitted, a dynasty from Saul on the throne of Israel. And the people are in love with Saul. The people will always, it's just one of those things where the people will be with Saul to the bitter end, it seems like. They love him. He seems to love the Lord. And it's the best thing that they could have asked for. In chapter 13, which we looked at last week, we looked at how Saul was preparing to go to war with the Philistines. But in doing so, because of the cowardice of his own soldiers, they were literally fleeing the camp, too afraid of the Philistines. And because of Samuel's not punctuality to offer the sacrifices that only he was really qualified to offer, Saul takes matters into his own hands, and he kind of half-effortly offers these offerings to God, but it's not recognized. They're bad offerings. They're unqualified offerings. And he, in practice, has such a passive experience with the sacrificial system, and it brings great disgrace to his name. It's very disgraceful in the nostrils of God. And even when we can't understand why God can be so serious sometimes, it's always worth remembering. that God understands the aspects of this life far better than we do. And when God sees the sacrifices, he sees the only way that you can maintain your relationship with him. When God sees the sacrifices, he sees the weight of your sin being placed on a perfectly innocent animal that has done nothing wrong, so that that sin will not be held against you. When God sees the sacrifices, he sees hope for the nation of Israel despite their sin. And in chapter 13, as we looked at it last week, Saul totally disregarded the sacrifices. He approached the sacrifices with such irreverence, and he didn't even recognize it. Samuel approaches him and calls him out on this. And Samuel reveals to Saul, the Lord was prepared to have your family on the throne of Israel forever. But now because of this, he says to Saul, your kingdom will not continue. Your kingdom will not continue.
Do you think Saul knew the steps to take as far as offering up that sacrifice?
He probably did.
Because I was thinking about that, and I thought that it was just complete disobedience, complete. I kind of get the feeling that Saul was getting the big head. You know what I'm saying? And that's just my opinion, but I kind of feel like he might have been getting the big head a little bit. And instead of waiting for Samuel, whether he was late or not, he just thought, well, I'm just going to do this myself because I'm Saul. I'm king of Israel.
I'm the king of Israel.
Yeah.
And he probably did. Offering sacrifices to God anywhere, that was common. You read about it all throughout the Old Testament. Somebody will be traveling and they just build an altar and make a sacrifice right there on the spot. But with Saul, he probably did have some idea on how to properly offer sacrifices to God. But there's this vibe that he gives off right now. There's such a fierce determination to just go fight the Philistines already. It's almost as though he views the sacrifice as an obstacle between him and the Philistines that he just has to get over already. So he does so with complete irreverence. And it's worth mentioning this. Even if he handled the sacrifice step by step in a visibly appropriate way, there was clearly something about this sacrifice that was irreverent. And I reference you back to the sacrifices of Cain and Abel, where Abel gave his first fruits, Cain did not. And God recognized Abel's faith in his sacrifice, but he did not recognize Cain's faith in his sacrifice. So that shows us that a sacrifice of some kind could have been offered to God, but just because it was a sacrifice, that doesn't mean that it would be approved by God. Because God's sacrifices are always to be offered on God's terms, not my terms. Not by the way that I want them, not at the speed that I want them to be offered. So as punishment for complete disregard of the sacrificial system in this act, God cuts off the future of Saul's family being on the throne of Israel. Samuel says to Saul, prophesies to Saul, your kingdom will not continue in this land. Not going to happen. So, we learn how this crusade against the Philistines is beginning towards the end of chapter 13. All of a sudden, there are no smiths to be found in the part of Israel that they're going through to go fight the Philistines. And whenever they begin to fight the Philistines, they're fighting with dull weapons. Some of these don't even really sound like they're legitimate weapons. It says there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people that were with Saul and Jonathan. So they go into this battle completely, almost unprepared. And it begins off at a rather pathetic start. And it's interesting that right after Samuel says to Saul, your kingdom will not continue in Israel, the very moment that we begin chapter 14, we read, it came to pass upon a day that Jonathan, the son of Saul, says to his armor bearer, let's go fight the Philistine garrison. It's very interesting that right after the king of Israel is just told that there will be no dynasty, we instantly are sent to look at what the crown prince of Israel is doing.
And he didn't even tell his father.
And he didn't tell his father. Whenever you looked at Jonathan, you saw the future of Israel.
And he was a godly man.
Yeah, Jonathan was a godly man too. Jonathan genuinely had the fear of the Lord in his heart, which in many aspects makes him a better pick to be king than his father. So, throughout the rest of all of this, you and I both have to look at the life of Jonathan, his accomplishments, his desires, his submission to the will of God, with this knowledge that there is no future for Saul's family on the throne of Israel. And if you don't know how this all ends up, you're almost left in suspense, knowing that Saul's line will not continue on the throne. So here we are looking at Jonathan, the crown prince of a nation that God created himself. He says to his armor bearer, let's go fight the Philistine garrison. And this is when they're out there. They're making their rounds to fight the Philistines, to kill however many enemies are waiting out there for them. And Jonathan is there with his armor bearer. The armor bearer was somebody who literally bore your armor. Many times the travel from your home to where the battlefield would be a great distance, and not every soldier would ride on horseback depending on the distance. And much of the armor that people wore back in the day was very, very heavy. So if you wore your armor all the way from home to the place where the battle took place, with all of this weight on your shoulders, with the sun beating down on you depending on the time of the year, by the time you got to the battlefield, you would have already been half dead, it felt like. So the purpose of the armor bearer was to carry your armor for you as you traveled out to the battlefield. And when you got there, the armor bearer would give you your armor, you would put it on, you would go fight, and the armor bearer would, I guess, stay out of the way, waiting for you to return. And then he would take the armor back and he would carry it. The purpose of the armor bearer was to just carry the armor of the soldier who was fighting. These were very necessary people to have, because without them, you're going to drain your energy before the fight even begins 99% of the time. So, he says to his armor bearer, and what's interesting is that he doesn't say to a group, he doesn't say to any kind of Hebrew group of soldiers, he just says to his armor bearer, come, let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that's on the other side. And he leaves the Israelites' camp without telling his father Saul. Let's look at verse 2. And Saul tarried in the uttermost part of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron, and the people that were with him were about 600 men. Now let me say this, that's a downgrade from the armies that Saul has fought with in the past. I think his first battle he had, 300,000 men with him. How in the world 300,000 turns into 600 is a little baffling. But you have to remember that a lot of his men have actually fled his camp because they were overcome with fear. Never mind the fact that they've been doing very good against the Philistines so far. But here's Saul with 600 soldiers under a pomegranate tree in Gibeah. Verse 3. And Ahiah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh, wearing an ephod, and the people knew that Jonathan was gone. Let's read verses 2 and 3 together. And Saul tarried in the uttermost part of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree which is in Migron, and the people that were with him were about 600 men, and Ahiah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest, in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people knew that Jonathan was gone. So, it's interesting that the descendant of Eli is right here with Saul and all of these men. And he's clearly there. It mentions that he's wearing the ephod, which was a sign of the priesthood. It was something that the priests wore. So it's clear here that Eli's descendant, Ahiah, is there to act as a priest. And what's very, very interesting about this is, if you remember what was prophesied over Eli, because of his seriously irreverent performance as high priest, and how this was so bad for the nation of Israel as a whole, Samuel, back when he was a boy, had to prophesy to Eli that the day would come whenever his descendants will be cut off from the priesthood. But we haven't seen that happen yet. But I would remember that prophecy, because we're not going to see that happen with Ahiah either. But I would remember that prophecy that Samuel gave to Eli at the beginning of this book, because that day is coming for Eli's descendants. So, all of these men are there. They're talking to each other about what are we going to do when we go out to fight the Philistines? Did I leave my water running? They're just sitting around, probably waiting to go to bed. And then all of a sudden, somebody just asked themselves, they asked out loud, has anybody seen Jonathan anywhere? And his friends say, I haven't seen Jonathan. He might be on the other side of camp. And these men start asking each other, and the questions start spreading throughout the camp. You seen Jonathan anywhere? You seen Jonathan anywhere? You seen Jonathan anywhere? I haven't seen Jonathan. I haven't seen Jonathan since this morning. I don't know. Have you seen Jonathan? No, I haven't seen Jonathan either. And people realized, you know what? I don't think that Jonathan's here. Where's Jonathan? And the word spreads that wherever Jonathan is, he's not here with us, which could mean literally anything. Is he dead? Did the Philistines capture him? I mean, anything could have happened. The crown prince, the future of Israel, is not where he needs to be. Was he one of the people who ran away? Where's Jonathan? Let's look at verse 4. And between the passages by which Jonathan sought to go over unto the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp rock on the one side, and a sharp rock on the other side, and the name of one was Bozez, and the name of the other Seneh. The forefront of the one was situate northward over against Michmash, and the other southward over against Gibeah. And Jonathan said to the young man that bore his armor, Come, and let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. Uncircumcised was a generic insult to speak of anybody who wasn't a Jew. It was actually maybe a little racist for their day standards, but this is very common. It's like whenever you see, no, never mind. But he says, let's go over to these uncircumcised, speaking of the Philistines. And continuing in verse 6, it may be that the Lord will work for us, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. Jonathan says to his armor bearer a serious statement of faith. He says, let's go over to those uncircumcised Philistines and let's show them who's boss. And the Lord may serve us. He says if we go over there, we could be provided the victory by the Lord. We could be given the victory. There is no restraint to the Lord to save us, or to save by many or by few. In other words, here we are, us two men. My father's 600 men army is all the way back there. We don't even really know how many Philistines are down there waiting for us. But who's to say that God cannot use two men to take down an army?
Yes.
Because
Amen.
nothing is too stressful. Nothing is hard for God.
Amen.
There is no restraint for God in this situation
No.
because God can do anything.
That's right. Yes.
So by His might, by His power, by His will, the two of us can go down there and we can send these Philistines running back home. Verse 7. And his armor bearer said unto him, do all that is in your heart. Turn you, behold, I am with you according to your heart. Then said Jonathan, behold, we will pass over unto these men, and we will discover ourselves unto them. In other words, we will present ourselves to them. If they say this unto us, tarry until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and will not go up unto them. But if they say this, come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has delivered them into our hand, and this shall be a sign unto us. And both of them discovered themselves unto the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, behold, the Hebrews come forth out of the holes where they had hid themselves. And the men of the garrison answered Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us, and we will show you a thing. And Jonathan said unto his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has delivered them into the hand of Israel.
Hallelujah.
You gotta admire the faith.
Hallelujah. Yes.
You gotta admire the faith.
Yes. I bet he didn't have a bit of fear.
He probably
There's no
didn't.
way he could have being only two of them.
I know.
I mean, his faith was just truly in God, knowing who God is.
Yeah.
Like David. Exactly. I mean, wow, that's something.
For Jonathan, the sign that the Lord had given the enemies to them was literally if the enemies challenged them to a fight right then and there. He says to his armor bearer, if they tell us to wait until we go out to battle, then we'll basically honor that. But if they challenge us right then and there on the spot, then that's how we know that we can take every last one of them.
Yes,
because the Lord is on our side.
Hallelujah.
And so Jonathan and his armor bearer, we don't even know who the armor bearer's name is. He's just an armor bearer. They walk up to the Philistine camp, and the Philistines say, look, here come the Hebrews out from those holes that they like to hide in. You know how that is.
Got a big chicken.
And then they go closer, I guess. They stand there, and the Philistines look right at these two Hebrews, these two Jews, and they say, why don't you come over here? We'll show you something if you come over here. And so they're literally taunting them right there. Like, hey, I got something on my belt here for you if you just want to come down here and look at it. Come down, come up to us. And Jonathan looks to his armor bearer and he says, brother, the Lord has given every one of them to Israel this day.
Amen.
Verse 13, and Jonathan climbed up upon his hands and upon his feet, and his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan. And his armor bearer slew after him. Listen, the whole purpose of the armor bearer is to just hold the breastplate and the helmet and the boots. Even the armor bearer pulls out this sword and just goes slashing away. He has this armor in one arm, he's got a sword in the other, and they're just tearing their way. They're mowing through these Philistines. And it's bad when the armor bearer is getting you like this. But the Lord will give the victory to anybody who trusts in him.
Amen. Hallelujah. Yes, Lord.
Verse 14, and that first slaughter, in other words, keep your eyes open because there's more coming. And that first slaughter, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, was about 20 men, within as it were a half acre of land, which a yoke of oxen might plow. And there was trembling in the host, in the field, and among all the people, the garrison, and the spoilers, they also trembled. and the earth quaked. So it was a very great trembling. At first, word spreads that two of those Hebrews, took out 20 men. And as they're already scared, the earth begins to shake from under them, which makes them even more terrified. So, verse 16, and the watchmen of Saul and Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away. In other words, all of those Philistines down there in that garrison, all of a sudden, you just see this massive blob down there begin to vanish off into the forest. And the watchmen in Saul's camp just see this happen, and they're probably thinking to themselves, well, that's odd. Didn't expect that to happen tonight. Hey, has anybody found Jonathan, by the way? Where's he at? And it says he looked, and behold, the multitude melted away, and they went on beating down one another. In other words, they're so ready to get out of there, they're literally trampling. They're climbing over each other just to get away from this area.
They're terrified.
Between those two Hebrews and this earthquake, we should play this very safe. Then said Saul unto the people that were with him, number now, and see who has gone from us. And when they had numbered, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. And Saul said unto Ahiah, bring here the ark of God, for the ark of God was at that time with the children of Israel. And it came to pass, while Saul talked unto the priests, that the noise that was in the host of the Philistines went on and increased. And Saul said unto the priest, withdraw your hand. And Saul and all the people that were with him assembled themselves. And they came to the battle. And behold, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was a very great discomfiture. Moreover, the Hebrews that were with the Philistines before that time, which went up with them into the camp from the country round about, even they also turned to be with the Israelites that were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, all the men of Israel which had hid themselves in Mount Ephraim, when they heard that the Philistines fled, even they also followed hard after them in battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed over unto Bethaven. So they go out to fight the Philistines. The Lord gives the Philistines into their hand. Saul numbers the people, and it's almost as though the sudden need to go fight has interrupted whatever he was about to do about Jonathan and the armor bearer missing. But they go out to fight the Philistines. It says there was a great discomfiture. And I'm going to be honest, I haven't looked up the exact meaning of this word, but discomfiture, judging by the context, probably refers to how the Israelites were given the upper hand against the Philistines, despite what has recently happened that God seriously despised. Well, let's take a look now at verse 24. The Lord has just saved Israel, and now they're fighting over into another territory, Bethaven. And the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had adjured the people, saying, cursed be the man that eats any food until evening, that I may be avenged on my enemies. So none of the people tasted any food. As they're traveling throughout this land,
And they're hungry.
And these men are the men who are about to go fight the Philistines. It's been majorly theorized that the reason why Saul brought this pretty rash command on his men was to maybe save time in this crusade against the Philistines. Maybe that's what he had in his mind, because to stop and to rest and to eat to him was probably seen as a waste of time. It doesn't specify, though, why exactly he does this. But just out of nowhere, they go, continue fighting into Bethaven, and as they're marching to the next area that they're going to get the Philistines, Saul, out of nowhere, commands his entire army that's there with him. Nobody stopped to eat anything until nightfall. And if anybody eats anything from nightfall, cursed be whoever that is. In other words, there are serious consequences that wait for the man who eats anything before I give you permission to eat something today.
And they were terrified of him, weren't they? I mean, I don't know if terrified is the right word, because I know they respected Saul and they loved Saul, but he was a big man too. You know, and I can just hear his thunderous voice, and I bet he was so intimidating.
And Saul probably did have that intimidating presence.
I bet.
If nothing else, because of his height.
Yeah.
He was a taller man.
Yeah.
You hear stories about Lyndon Johnson, the president, who was very tall, and you hear a lot of stories about how if he was having a conversation with someone who was trying to argue with him about a bill or something, he would literally use the fact that he was taller than everyone else in the room to his advantage to intimidate these people who were trying to argue with him. And you can go to Google and find pictures of Lyndon Johnson just standing so close to these people who are trying to debate and almost arching, looking down over them. In one picture, a guy is literally having to lean back and he's trying to laugh off whatever was happening in that conversation. So whenever you have this big guy who says, you don't want to disobey me, on top of the fact, it is very likely that at this point Saul was developing an intense reputation among some, at least, people in Israel. Because later on, we learn of how even Samuel was afraid of Saul. I'm not going to get into what all happened. What all happened. But we learn in the near future of how Saul, to some people, is a man to be feared. And that's not the reverential kind of fear. That's the kind of, I'm afraid of you fear. So Saul is a very imposing man. He knows that he's in charge of this army. He knows that this is his army. He knows that they can't rebel against him because first of all, they're rebelling against God's decision for the king. So which of you are going to do that? So he gives this command, don't eat anything. And throughout the entire day, most of these men who, for the record, would not be on horseback, they are walking all day on their feet, and they're never given permission throughout the entire 18 to 20 hour period to just stop and rest their legs and eat something to refresh themselves. We're about to go throw all of our strength at the Philistines, but if we keep doing this, half of our strength is going to be gone. And that's even with considering these armor bearers who are carrying our armor for us. When we put this armor on, when we go to the Philistines, we might fall apart under the weight of this armor with this command. But you know what? It doesn't say that anybody speaks up. Nobody really protests this in this moment. Verse 25, and all they of the land came to a wood, and there was honey upon the ground. And when the people were come into the wood, behold, this is referring to a forest area, the wood. When they were come unto the wood, behold, the honey dropped, but no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan heard not when his father charged the people with the oath. Wherefore he put forth the end of the rod that was in his hand, and dipped it in a honeycomb, and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes were enlightened. He takes the refreshment that everybody else in this army is needing, but he doesn't know why nobody is stopping to eat this honey. He doesn't know why this honeycomb is right here in front of us. It's a natural, very nice resource. You would think that God himself grew this honeycomb just for us. It's a natural source of nourishment just waiting for us in this forest, in this journey, in this crusade of ours against the Philistines. But Jonathan didn't hear Saul's command. Probably because he was out there doing everything that Saul should have been doing this entire time, killing the Philistines.
2 of them.
Jonathan didn't hear it though. Verse 28. Then answered one of the people and said, your father straitly charged the people with an oath, saying, cursed be the man that eats any food this day, and the people were faint. Then said Jonathan, my father has troubled the land. See, I pray you, how mine eyes have been enlightened, because I tasted a little of this honey. How much more, if haply the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they found, for had there not been now a much greater slaughter among the Philistines, if you just let these men rest a little bit and eat a little bit, who's to say that we wouldn't have gotten the Philistines already? How much time are we gaining exactly by not resting a little bit every now and then? Well, now we get to verse 31. And they smote the Philistines that day from Michmash to Aijalon, and the people were very faint.
They were so hungry and weak.
They're probably zombified at this point. They haven't put anything in their system, and they just spent a lot of energy and strength defeating the Philistines. And they're probably feeling zombified. In other words, have you ever felt that way where you were so drained of energy, it's like all you could do in the moment was just stand there and breathe for a minute. Like you felt like you couldn't really do much of anything else except just breathe for a minute, because the task that you just did was so demanding, and you just need a rest just for 5 seconds at least. They're all feeling just like that. Very faint. They are exhausted. Some of them are probably very hungry, borderline starving at this point. But what reason did Saul give to the command? He said, don't do this, because I am going to avenge myself among these Philistines.
Again, I think he had the big head. I really do. I think he had a major big head, and we're going to see what that's going to.
And you know, back in verse 24, you read that word avenged on my enemies, and at first you wonder, what in the world are you being avenged of exactly? What did you lose that you feel like you have to gain once again? Was there a time where God did not give you the victory? What's going on? What do you mean avenged of my enemies? You know what I think? And if anyone has a different theory on this, please say what's on your mind. I think that after Saul was under that tree in Gibeah, and he gets word from one of his watchmen that the whole Philistine camp has dissolved back into the forest, and he has them number the men and their army right there, and he learns that the only two who are not there are Jonathan and his armor bearer. I think in that moment it clicked with him why those Philistines suddenly were dissolving back into the forest. And I believe in this moment, whether Saul realized it or not, deep down in his heart, there was jealousy that he had against his son, because he was the king of Israel, not Jonathan.
Well, we're going to kind of see that play out too.
Yeah.
And even as Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. So you can kind of see a divide taking place.
Yeah.
And I don't want to give anything away, but it tends to
it gets worse. It grows. It grows.
Yeah.
This is something that we're not going to see the last of.
And then also sometimes I wonder too, was it when, is he angry about Samuel prophesying, telling him your kingdom is done?
Yeah.
And is that another reason? I'm going to avenge because I'm Saul. I don't know, but
it could be because of that. That could have something to do with it.
But I think I agree with you though about Jonathan, his son. I think there was jealousy there, and if you know the story, because you see what happens, and I think it probably started there. Yeah.
And it's after he he has the army numbered.
Yeah.
It's after he learns that the only two who are not here are your son and the armor bearer. After that is when he gives this very unnatural command to not eat anything. And even after they win in a battle against the Philistines, he's still not allowing them to eat anything.
Yeah.
What in the world is going on? I think that when he says, I'm going to avenge myself among my on my enemies, what he's really saying is the Philistines are mine, they're not my sons. It's almost like he feels like he lost a trophy whenever he learns, whenever it clicks with him, that Jonathan just sent that entire garrison back into the forest.
And you know what? And we're going to see, people get jealous. Even in the church, people get jealous of people. And I've always said jealousy is nothing but a spirit of darkness.
Right.
And you are probably so right. He is jealous of his son. And because of him saying, you can't eat anything, it's like he's taking it out on everybody. And we're going to see how that hinders him.
Yeah.
That hinders there.
It is like he's taking out, and we're not even told that he's even approached his son about any of this stuff yet. And it's so interesting because if you're the king of a nation and the crown prince is doing a better job than you are in the battlefield, you would think that that would be seen as a good thing.
Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah, the future of Israel is in good hands.
If that was your child, wouldn't you just be so happy and proud?
Oh, yes.
But
but
that's
no,
not what we
him.
really see right here.
Well, I think what it was, he was afraid that people would want Jonathan more than him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he wanted to prove to people he was still the king.
He was the king, yeah. And
Yeah.
again, that jealousy of his son.
Jealousy
Yeah.
of his son.
Yeah.
And yeah.
You do.
You do see it. You see it a lot today.
But
especially
I've
with
even
things
told
that are
married
kids.
people, I remember telling her one time, she was so jealous. Her husband, and they were married for a long time. We were watching, no, I didn't think anyone was watching, but they were, because she got so mad. There was a Miss America pageant on, and we were all in the living room, and everybody was just talking. I had no idea. And I knew she'd gotten mad, but I didn't know why. Later I found out because she thought her husband was watching that Miss America pageant. But jealousy, and what do you think they did? They went home and fought like cats and dogs. And I'm telling you, it is a spirit of darkness. And you see it everywhere.
And some people act like jealousy is not as serious as something like slander, whatever. But to that, I would say pay attention to what we're looking at right here. Pay very close attention.
Exactly, and what comes from it. Woo.
So,
Yeah.
they get to the Philistines. Saul leads them into victory against the Philistines. But what do they have to show for themselves at the end of it? They are very faint.
Yes.
Let's look at verse 32. And the people flew upon the spoil, and took the sheep, the oxen, and calves, and slew them on the ground. And the people did eat them with the blood.
No, they're saying they ate it raw.
Well, they ate it raw, but listen, there's a lot more that goes into what we just read than just the fact that they ate raw meat without cleansing it of the blood. It was sinful in the Old Covenant. God marked this action, what they just did, as a point-blank sin to eat any animal meat with the blood. So not only is it unhealthy, but it was sinful in the Old Covenant. Now, I don't want to hold you hostage on this, but I've had to teach on this in my Bible class before, and while I don't remember all of the information about it, all I'll say is that first of all, there are 6 million reasons why you don't eat the blood of an animal with the meat. But many people suspect that this had to do with the sacredness of the animal sacrifices. Whenever they would kill an animal that they were sacrificing, they would often cut it in an area where the body could drain very easily so that the animal could die as quickly as possible. It was a humane way to look at it. And even whenever the priest would eat the meat of the lamb, in the presence of God when he was making the sin offering, or one of those offerings. I don't know which offering it was, but the one where the priest had to eat the whole lamb, even there, he had to drain the animal of the blood. Because if the blood stays in the animal, then I guess there's also the risk that the animal could still be alive. But you get this savage I don't mean savage the way people use it today, like, ooh, that's kind of cool. I'm talking about honest, barbaric sense that comes from this.
Yeah.
Whenever they see all of these spoils in the Philistine camp, there's just this caveman presence. All of a sudden that shows up. They just go to these animals and they begin to devour everything on these animals.
But it show you how hungry. I mean, we think, oh, I would never do that, you know?
Yeah.
But they were so hungry and so weak, you know?
It says that they flew upon the spoil. They made a beeline, not for the gold and for the pots and all that stuff, but they made a beeline for the animals. And it wasn't to sacrifice, it was to consume. Then they told Saul, verse 33, saying, behold, the people sin against the Lord, and that they eat with the blood. And he said, you have transgressed. Roll a great stone unto me this day. And Saul said, disperse yourselves among the people, and say unto them, bring me hither every man his ox, and every man his sheep, and slay them here, and eat, and sin not against the Lord in eating with the blood. And all the people brought every man his ox with him that night, and slew them there. And Saul built an altar unto the Lord. The same was the first altar that he built unto the Lord. In other words, the very same altar that he built in the previous chapter that Samuel had to rebuke him over, that God took away the future of his family over on the throne, is the exact same thing that he builds right here to hopefully atone for the sins of all of his men. But it's in the exact same spirit as the one that he was rebuked over just not too long ago. It's in the exact same level of low reverence that he was just prophesied over cost him the future of his family on the throne of Israel. Exact same spirit, exact same altar to God. But hey, at least it was to God. Never mind the fact that the faith behind it was so fragile at best. And it's worth mentioning that Saul doesn't even ask why they're doing this to begin with. He doesn't even really open himself up to the possibility that his decision to force these men not to eat, at the risk of them being punished very greatly, that might have had something to do with their barbaric desperation when they win this battle and they see these fat animals all around them. He doesn't even do that. When they tell him what was going on, the first thing he says is he starts to condemn his soldiers. You have sinned against the Lord. Bring your oxen here and we'll kill them here and we'll do this appropriately. And then Saul once again builds an altar right there in front of everybody. Verse 36, and Saul said, let us go down after the Philistines by night and spoil them until the morning light, and let us not leave a man of them. And they said, do whatever seems good unto you. Then said the priest, let us draw near here unto God. And Saul asked the counsel of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you deliver them into the hand of Israel? But he answered him not that day. So first of all, what is God doing, not answering somebody when they pray? That's the first question that you probably have when you read that. Well, let me say this isn't the first time that we'll read about this kind of thing happening. But, again, this is my opinion of what's happening. First of all, Saul doesn't go to the Lord in his own volition. The priest who's there has to basically remind Saul, hey, we should inquire of the Lord. And it's nightfall. They've been walking around all day, journeying all day, feeling malnourished until they had to sin to please themselves, and after they fight, he builds the altar. He doesn't even give them time to rest overnight. After the sacrifice that he makes, he instantly turns around and says to his men, okay, now we're going to go back over there to the Philistines, and we're going to wipe them out until morning, okay? Are y'all ready for that? And they say to him, they don't say, yes, king, we're behind you. They say, listen, man, you just do whatever seems good to you, all right? And then the priest who's there with him, Ahiah, let me see, was that his name? Ahiah walks up to Saul and he says, why don't we go take counsel from the Lord? You know.
And it's only then when Saul calls.
And it's after that.
Yeah.
It's after that. That's when Saul decides to go and ask the Lord what to do. And what I think this is false humility on display. I don't think that Saul is really interested in what God wants him to do right now.
Again, big head.
And if he was, especially being raised a Hebrew, I mean, good luck being a Hebrew and not knowing to pray to God.
Yeah.
But if he was really interested, he would have asked the Lord already without having to be reminded by a Levite, hey, you know, maybe we should ask the Lord what our next step is going to be. You know, just maybe.
I would have thought, and I know I don't want to take a lot of time, but I would have thought after he saw all those men doing what they were doing, devouring those, you know, all that raw meat, that he would have just put his face to the ground and cried out to God and said, you know, Lord, forgive me for starving these men because it was his fault.
Yeah.
You
And you know what? There
But
are
he
other
didn't
people
do
in the
that.
Bible who, if they were in that situation, that's what they would have done.
They would have done that.
They would have fallen
Absolutely.
to their
Moses
face, to their
would have done
face.
that.
Yeah.
David would have done that. You know,
Saul
Elijah
doesn't
would have
do
done
that.
that.
You know what's interesting is that back in, you know, in all those chapters ago, whenever Saul first became king and the Ammonites were threatening the men of Jabesh Gilead, and he gathers a troop of 300,000 men to go fight the Ammonites with, and it's a glaring victory, and you know, it's just such a good day to be an Israelite. And then Saul says at the end of it, the Lord gave us the victory today. You know, and it makes you wonder, because it's always easy to acknowledge the Lord when everything is going exactly the way that you want it to go.
Yes, that's
When
right.
everything is going perfectly. But whenever things begin to stop going the way you want them to, many people fall into this trap where they suddenly have this drive to solve the problem themselves. Yeah, they know intellectually that they should pray to God, that praying to God is good, but they fall into this mindset where God suddenly takes back seat, whether they realize that they put him in that position or not, you know, for lack of a better phrase there. And there's this urge that I have to solve this problem because there's a way that I want this problem to be solved. Let me figure this out.
Well, there's my way I want this problem to be solved.
Yeah.
That's usually what it is.
And that's what it is.
Yeah.
So
I was on my way to Jonesboro today, I tell you, because I have to leave right when the kids leave to get over there in time for my radiation, and it was raining, and there was traffic everywhere, and all the way I was saying, Lord, you're my pilot, Lord, you're my pilot, Lord, you're my pilot.
yeah.
I mean, that's what we need to do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lord, you're my, you know, the older you get, it's hard to drive in the rain with a lot of traffic.
Yeah.
And I was just saying, Lord, you're my pilot. Lord,
Yeah.
I'm telling you, a lot of those curves and those dips of water and stuff, he was driving my vehicle.
Yeah. And he'll do it.
That's
He'll do it.
right.
He'll do it.
But that's the way we should be, which believe me, I struggle in many areas. But that's the way we should be. You're right. When things are on, you know, the mountain, oh, everything's going okay. But it's sometimes we say, well, let me solve this problem the way that I want to solve it. And we do, if we're not careful, we will try to push God aside.
Mhm.
He'll never go on the back burner. Never. But we do try to do things ourselves, and it just messes us up.
Yeah.
You know, we get ourselves in a fix.
And you know, recently, Saul has had to deal with a victory that his son has gotten that he thinks he should have gotten.
Yeah.
And then just recently, he has watched his entire army break the law of God by eating animals with the blood. And
it's really a tragic story. I mean, it really is.
And in the back of his mind, he might be considering how he shouldn't have given that command, but he does. And after Ahiah says, you want to talk to God about this before you just go down there with all these men to the Philistines. I mean, God hasn't even been really mentioned at any point up to this point in the chapter. So Saul does go, he prays to God, and God does not say a thing. Now God is all-knowing, and he's omnipresent, as we call it. So it's not that God honestly doesn't hear Saul. God hears the words of Saul. But could it be that God doesn't respond because in his heart, Saul is not really asking God for anything right now? Could it be? And because God looks at the heart, he doesn't acknowledge Saul.
Sad.
It's verse 38. And Saul said, "Draw you near here, and the chief of the people, and know and see wherein the sin that has been this day. For as the Lord lives, which saves Israel, though it be in Jonathan my own son, he shall surely die." But there was not a man among all the people that answered him. What's happening is that the way that these events are going is that he suspects that God isn't answering him because somebody out there has sinned. And because somebody has sinned, the Lord is not talking to me, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kill whichever of you have sinned against God, and then maybe God will talk to me. Verse 40. Nobody answers him. He puts his eyes on Jonathan. He says, even if my son has done this, he will die today. And after the people hear that, they shut their mouth.
Yeah.
Because, truth be told, Jonathan has a better head on his shoulders throughout all of this than Saul does. And we are not about to put Jonathan on the chopping block for crying out loud.
Yeah.
So after their very loud silence, then he said unto all Israel, Be you on one side, and I and Jonathan my son will be on the other side. And the people said unto Saul, Do what seems good unto you.
Again, whatever.
Yeah. Therefore Saul said unto the Lord God of Israel, Give a perfect lot. And Saul and Jonathan were taken, but the people escaped. Now this refers to casting lots, and I've done a little bit of research on what exactly this was. Apparently we're not 100% sure what casting lots actually look like, but basically the idea behind this practice, from what I've read, we're not 100% sure, but the idea was kind of like when you pull straws, or whenever you flip a coin. At first, it seems like you're leaving whatever the outcome is up to chance, but you have to remember in the Old Covenant, the Spirit of God didn't dwell inside of all of God's people because the sin of the world hadn't been taken away. So what people would do, and in some instances in the Old Testament, God even told people to cast lots because they didn't have the Spirit on the inside of them to give them discernment on a situation. So what they would do is God would reveal his will through very hands-on ways, such as casting lots, like pulling straws. God would reveal his will to these people through that means. So it was just working with what they had. And Saul says to the Lord, Give us a perfect lot. This is referring to the lots are now about to be cast. Whatever this is talking about. But they're about to find out who the sinner is, or, who the sinner is. Truth be told, the only person who Saul should be looking at right now is himself. Yeah. He starved his entire army. Yeah. Then he accused all of them of sinning instead of considering how he made them suffer for an entire day, unnecessarily so. He should be looking at himself, but it's not me. Somebody else is causing God not to talk to me right now, and we're going to root them out So be it. So Saul and Jonathan were taken, but the people escaped. And Saul said, "Cast lots between me and Jonathan my son." And Jonathan was taken. In other words, whatever the lot was, it fell on Jonathan. And Saul registered in that moment that his son was the one who sinned against him. So, Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." And Jonathan told him and said, "I did but taste a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand, and lo, I must die." Saul says to his son, after this stuff happens, when the lot falls on his son, he says, "You are clearly the guilty party." Yeah, Bible study starts at 6, sister. Anyways, we're gonna continue now. We're gonna continue.
Okay.
So, the lot falls on Jonathan. Saul looks right at his son, sitting across from him, and he says, "You tell me what happened." And Jonathan looks right back at his father, and he says, "When we were out there in the wilderness, I didn't hear you say not to eat anything. And when we came across this honeycomb in the wilderness, I put my stick out and I took some of the honey, and it felt great. And now I have to die because I ate something from a honeycomb." And Saul answered, "God do so and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan." And the people said unto Saul, "Shall Jonathan die, who has wrought this great salvation in Israel? God forbid. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has wrought with God this day." So the people rescued Jonathan, that he died not. People look at all of this happening, and it's interesting how it said when they began to cast these lots, it said the people escaped. In other words, the people said, "You know what, actually, I don't want to do this." And the idea is that they just go sit down somewhere. So the only two people who are left to cast lots is literally just Saul and his son. And then this happens, and then they look at what's happening between Saul and his son, his legacy. And these people are probably thinking, surely Saul is not so serious about all of this, to the point that he would kill his own son, who has really been the backbone of this army, second only to God himself. Surely that's not happening. Yeah. And the conversation quickly flares up. Saul looks at Jonathan and says, "I hope God does more to you than what I'm going to do to you today. You will die today, Jonathan, for what you've done." And the people instantly step in. Everything that has been going on throughout all of this chapter caves in right here. The people, the soldiers who are doing all of this fighting against the Philistines, this is the moment where it all breaks through and they start to actively resist the king. They say, "Wait a minute. Jonathan has been bringing salvation to Israel throughout all of this stuff, and you're wanting to kill him over a honeycomb. That's not going to happen. You're going to have to get through everybody in this army in order to do that. We're not going to let that happen."
So what do we think this is doing to Saul?
Oh,
Making
yeah.
him more jealous. It's just festering up inside of him.
Anger up.
Yeah.
So whenever 600 men are against you, Saul backs down. And Jonathan does not die for committing the sin of eating a honeycomb. Then Saul went up from, verse 46, then Saul went up from following the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. So Saul took the kingdom over Israel and fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab and against the children of Ammon and against Edom and against the kings of Zobah and against the Philistines, and whithersoever he turned himself, he vexed them. And what honestly could be happening here, it gives the idea that Saul becomes a man of war after this happens. He doesn't become much of a leader for his people, as he just becomes a bloodthirsty maniac to the enemies of Israel. And it makes you wonder if what happened with Jonathan and the Philistines in the valley got to him so bad that this idea that he now has to avenge his honor among the army is so serious that it literally turns him into a bloodthirsty maniac towards the enemies of Israel. Now all he can think about is killing the Philistines, and not just the Philistines, but also the people of Ammon, and not just them, but also the people in Moab, all of them, all of them, all of them.
I bet he eats.
Yeah.
God forgive me.
And he gathered a host and smote the Amalekites, and delivered Israel out of the hands of them that spoiled them. Now the sons of Saul were Jonathan and Ishuel and Melchishua, and the names of his two daughters were these: the name of the firstborn Merab, and the name of the younger Michal. And the name of Saul's wife was Ahinoam, the daughter of Ahimaaz, and the name of the captain of his host was Abner. That's a name you're going to want to remember. Son of Ner, Saul's uncle. And Kish was the father of Saul, and Ner the father of Abner was the son of Abiel. And there was sore war against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he took him unto him.
Wow, so he just has like this rage, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He just,
Sore war against the Philistines. And it gives off the impression that all of this mess that we just got done reading about happened every time he went out to war. It's not that he always told them don't eat, but it gives off this impression that there was always something that made fighting with Saul absolutely miserable. Even though the Lord would give them the victory at the end of the day, the process, the journey to that victory was so miserable. But what makes it even worse is that these soldiers are basically in a hostage situation after all of this happens. Because it says, anytime Saul a strong man in Israel, didn't matter if he was a baker, didn't matter if he was a smith, didn't matter if he was a father, didn't matter any of that. He took him into the army. He commanded this man, who appeared to be strong and able, to join the army. He creates this demanding draft system, and you know, in the ancient Middle East, you can't dodge a draft like you can here in America, because your life will be on the line, not just your freedom.
yeah.
And anytime there was a strong man, a man who was big and seemed to be good in combat, he looked like he could have been good in combat, Saul would drag that man and force this man to devote himself to the armies of Israel. And throughout all of this, Saul thinks that he just has to avenge his reputation. And you know what's so weird is that his reputation was not even damaged by Jonathan's victory over the Philistines to begin with. There's nothing that says that all of a sudden his men begin to doubt him because Jonathan won one victory, for that matter, against the Philistine garrison. He jumped to this conclusion because Jonathan did something that he wanted to do. This is very, very concerning for the future of Israel. If he's taking our men, what else is he going to take? And you know what's really bitter about all of this is that Samuel warned them that this would happen.
Yeah.
Whenever they forced Samuel to step down as the judge, he prophetically told them that this king would take your men away from you. And this king would go on to take your daughters away from you. This king would take your fields away from you. And throughout the remainder of this book, we will see just that happen.
May I say something?
Mm-hmm.
And I know
Yeah, go ahead.
But no, I just think, because I've said, and I've told myself this too, that the enemy will put those imaginary problems up here, and he'll make you think, oh, people are looking at you, or people are talking what about you? And that's what he was doing to Saul. He was making Saul think, oh my goodness, you know, these people are losing respect for me because of what my son did. These people are not, you know, I have to prove myself to them. I have to prove myself to them. When in fact, like you said, there's no proof of that whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
You know, had he just said, wow, look what the Lord has done. Look what the Lord has done through my son.
Right.
You know, and just backed his son, but instead he didn't. He decided to listen to that enemy. Because he does, I'm telling you, he will put imaginary problems up here if we allow him to.
I kinda thought, you know, him being the prince, you know, I kinda thought what most of his problem was, he was afraid the people